Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. I know all your time is very precious. My name is Michelle Maris, and I am the new family coordinator here for the district. This is my first year in this role. It's actually the first year that we've had the position. And one of the things I want to do is get resources in the hands of parents. So when we surveyed our parents, we gained some good information about what families felt like they kind of needed as far as resourcing. So that's kind of what brought about tonight. But before we get started, I want to make sure everybody, if you are here and online, I want you to be able to have access to our door prizes tonight too. So if you could, in the chat area, put your name in, first or last name, and what school that you kind of represent, whether you're a staff or a parent. And then later on, we are going to have a time of question and answers with Dr. Jafijis. And if here in the audience, we have cards. So if you want to write your question on those, you can. But later, if you're online, we'll use the chat feature for you to ask questions there. And then the last kind of business thing I wanted to mention, that if you are a staff, you can get the CPUDs. And there is a clipboard out on the table when you first came in tonight. So hopefully you saw that, and that you can sign that. If you're online, I want you to make a note in the chat, and then I'll put your name on there, and then Amy Lawson will probably track you down later to get your signature for that time. All right, so when we did the survey that I just mentioned, we had basically 4 themes that came to the top. And the first one was dealing with bullies. And during the elementary parent-teacher conferences, I made a handout available to all the parents on that. If you're still interested in that, let me know. The second topic was mental health, anxiety, depression. When I saw that, I immediately thought of my friend, Dr. Steve, because that's kind of his specialty. And the third topic was social media, internet safety. And then the last one that came up was, again, another mental health issue, which dealt more with stress, self-care, and resilience. So when I talked to Steve, he and I chatted about what we could really do that would benefit parents. And he came up with this idea of, let's just help them recognize when kids are struggling with ADHD and depression. So that's kind of where we landed on this topic for tonight. And I'm going to take a minute here. Let's see. And introduce him to you. I know him. I met him about 3 years ago. We were both speaking at a conference that he hosts. And here, let me switch this back over to where everybody can be a minute. It's like there. All right. Make sure everybody's getting in. Okay. Some of you, it could be a part-time job, someone being over here telling me, hey, let somebody else in the room. But let me introduce Steve to you. He is a medical doctor that serves and is the founder and president of Key Ministries. He is a child and adolescent psychiatrist who over 25 years of knowledge gained through clinical practice and teaching, with extensive research experience evaluating medications prescribed to teens and adolescents for ADHD, anxiety, and depression. Dr. Gurchevich has been a presenter in over 35 nations, both national and international medical conferences, and in the past recipient of the Exemplary Psychiatric Award from the National Alliance of Mental Health and Illness. So I know that you will gain a lot of great information from Dr. Gurchevich tonight. So why don't we all, whether it's a clapping of hands in your chat or in person here, welcome him to talk tonight.
Well, good evening, everybody. And Michelle, thanks so much for having me. Technology is truly a blessing tonight because despite, having all of my shots, I have breakthrough COVID, and I am on quarantine right now at home with my wife. And so, so again, I'd love to be there in person, but I'm not allowed to be anywhere in person at this point. So one of the things that I have told folks is that basically COVID has felt like a job creation program for child psychiatrists. Based upon some of the things that Michelle had shared, it sounds like mental health related topics are something that are of great interest to you, there's a reason for that. And for a long time, we've seen this gradual increase in the number of kids who are being identified with having significant emotional behavioral disorders. Part of what I think we're going to do tonight is that I want to spend a little bit of time with you talking a little bit about what was the state of our children's mental health before COVID. We're going to take a little bit of a look at how this has been impacted by everything that our kids have been through for the last 20 months. Kind of share some ideas in terms of like why certain kids may be struggling right now more than others. But I think that the biggest reason why people want to be a part of something like this is you hear these things in the media, you hear people talking about it, you hear your friends and neighbors talking about it. Parents of like other kids, who go to your school. And one of the concerns is, should I be concerned about my son or daughter? And so part of what we're going to do tonight as well is that we're going to take a look at 11 very specific signs of mental health distress that parents and teachers can look for that, are usually pretty strong indicators that it's time to kind of take a look at whether or not, mental health concerns are an issue, for your particular child. And so one of the things I think a lot of folks have had a hard time kind of like getting their brains around is that by far and away, like when you look at disability statistics, the most common disability that we see in the child and adolescent population is mental illness. And roughly 1 in 5 of school-age kids will meet criteria for at least one mental health condition at any given point in time. And so what you see up here is if you take a look at the 3 most common like categories of conditions that we would see in kids, which are ADD and ADHD, anxiety and depression. Again, around 20% of our kids are dealing with one or more of these issues. So that statistically speaking, ADHD, may be a little more common or it's more frequently diagnosed, interestingly enough, now in teenagers as opposed to school-age children. We know that anxiety is a huge issue. Particularly for, kids middle school age, high school age, so that probably about 1 in 10 kids in the United States have a significant issue with anxiety. Less than 1 in 5 ever get any kind of professional treatment for that anxiety. And, if you look at like the current statistics, probably like 1 in 25 school age kids and about 1 in 14 teenagers at any given point in time would meet the criteria for having a significant depression. Now, one of the things I think that a lot of folks have heard discussed in the media is the reality that for about the last 10 years or so, prior to COVID, there had been this steady, almost unrelenting increase in numbers being reported of children and teenagers completing suicide. So that suicide's now the second leading cause of death among teenagers and young adults in the United States. We know that rates have progressively increased since about 2007, 2008. And that overall there's been about a 60 to 70% increase. And again, that this was going into the pandemic, in terms of the number of completed suicides that we were seeing in young people across the United States. And the interesting thing is, if you go back and you look at statistics back into like the 1980s, so I finished my general psychiatry residency 1989, child psychiatry fellowship in 1991. Beginning about 1990, suicide rates started to drop in children and teenagers. And they stayed relatively low, and the suicide rate went down for 15 consecutive years. Well, the first antidepressant shown to have any benefit to kids, Prozac, came out in 1988. The second one, Zoloft, came out in 1989. And so as the theory went, you had medication, you had increased awareness, you had other kinds of treatment, that appeared to be putting a dent in the problem. But somewhere around like 2005, things started to change, and in particular over the last 10 years, you know, we have seen rates skyrocketing. And one of the things that we know is that the kids who seem to be more vulnerable would be, again, kids from sexual minorities, kids who've been exposed to trauma, kids from families of lower socioeconomic status. There has been an increase in the rate of suicide among Black children that is greater than the rate that's seen in the general population. And so that this is a very, very serious health concern at this point in time. Now, we start thinking about this. Can you think of anything that's happened in the last decade that would maybe cause these rates to go up? And the one obvious thing that's different is the presence of these smartphones and the amount of time that kids spend on social media. So that between just 2012 to 2018, we went from 40% of teenagers having smartphones to 90% roughly in 2018. And I'm sure that the numbers are higher at this point. So that the last time we actually had a real Child Psychiatry Academy meeting in person nationwide, there was a study that was presented that showed that kids who are spending 3 or more hours a day on their phone are 60% more likely to develop a significant depression than kids who spend an hour a day or less on the phone. We also know, and again, it sounds like Michelle was addressing with one of your talks or one of your topics, the notion of bullying. We know that kids who are cyberbullied are twice as likely to attempt suicide or to be engaged in self-injurious behavior. The interesting thing is that the same thing holds true with the bullies themselves. And so oftentimes the kids who are perpetrating this are kids who are struggling with some of their own emotional or mental health issues. Now, if you've been following the news in the last couple of months, there was an expose that came out about the middle of September in the Wall Street Journal where reporters got their hands on a variety of internal documents at Facebook who, own Instagram. And so, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat are the 3 most commonly used social media profiles for platforms for kids. And so what was extraordinarily disheartening about this is that it turns out Facebook has all kinds of internal data looking at the impact or the negative impact that Instagram, the company that they own, that having kids participating on that platform certainly has, well documented negative impacts on mental health. So, and again, that this is their own internal data, that 13% of kids who reported suicidal thoughts in the UK and 6% of kids in the US trace the desire to kill themselves directly to Instagram. That this has been a huge issue with girls. And so that, from a body image standpoint, more than 40% of Instagram users that they surveyed who described themselves as feeling unattractive, reported that feeling developed looking at pictures of other girls or pictures of other women, specifically on the app. And I think it's telling that, that there was a Chinese company that started TikTok, and that the Chinese government has now banned their kids from accessing social media and limits their video game playing time to Friday night and a limited amount of time on weekends. Whatever you say about like the Chinese government, their ethics, those guys aren't stupid. And I think that they've seen some of the data out there, taking a look at the impact that these various social media platforms have, on self-image, mental health, academic performance, and a variety of other parameters. Now, if you're looking at other explanations for suicide rates going up, here's one that I've found to be really interesting that you almost never hear people talk about, but it's very relevant to certain subgroups of kids that we see in our practice. And so one of the things that is a major risk factor for suicidal behavior, it turns out, is kids who cross sexual boundaries and become sexually active. This is such an issue, particularly for our kids, where one of the things that they struggle with is that maybe they think too much about things, and kids who tend to have a much harder time being able to let go of things that bother them. So that, it's to the point that, like, if I have a kid that I'm treating, for example, with obsessive compulsive disorder, I am very proactive up front to tell parents that the first time, excuse me, that the first time they end a relationship that has become serious, there's a very good possibility, and we have to watch very carefully for the emergence of any kind of suicidal behavior. Again, we know that kids who are sexual minorities, kids from the LGBTQ community, appear to be more at risk. But if you start taking a look at, like, compared to those students who have not been sexually active, students who experience sexual contact with the same, with a member of the same sex or both sexes, were 12 times more likely to need medical attention following a suicide attempt. But this simply isn't, this is not an issue that's limited to that community. That boys who are sexually active, with heterosexual contacts only, are 7 times more likely to need medical attention following suicide attempts. And girls with only heterosexual contacts are more than 3 times as likely to need medical attention following suicide attempts. And so that while the overall number of kids, if you take a look at, like, 7th to 12th graders who report being sexually active, is in fact lower than it was 10 years ago. One of the things that's very clear when you look at this data is that for every sexual partner kids have, the risk of suicide continues to increase. So it's a greater risk for kids who have had, 2 contacts than 1, or 3 contacts versus 2, or 4 contacts versus 3. And in particular, having sexual, being sexually active at an early age clearly appears to put a lot of kids at risk. Now, this is a look at some data from last fall. This was out of a CDC publication where they surveyed parents and asked them about the question in terms of whether or not their school-age children, 5 to 12-year-olds, whether they were seeing a worsening of their mental health. And overall, a little less than 1 in 4 had reported this as an issue. Again, with smaller groups describing elevated symptoms of depression and elevated symptoms of anxiety. But when you start taking a look at some other data, it's clear that not only are we dealing with a COVID emergency, but we're dealing with a true mental health emergency. And so this is some CDC data from this past summer. And they were taking a look specifically at suicidality among adolescents during the pandemic. And so the number of emergency room visits for suspected suicide attempts were roughly 22% higher during the summer of 2020 than they were in the summer of 2019. They were 39% higher this past winter than they had been in the winter of 2019. And if you take a look at, like, last winter, 2021, emergency room visits for suspected suicide attempts were up over 50% in girls, compared to where they were before the pandemic. Interestingly enough, the rate in boys stayed about the same. And so, you start thinking about this, and I'm not sure what the situation was like, where you guys were at in Illinois last winter, but here in Northeast Ohio, um, our schools were like all over the map in terms of how they handled COVID. Typically like the closer you got to the center of like big cities, if you look at Cleveland or Columbus, our urban schools were primarily closed. A lot of the suburban schools were going to some sort of a hybrid model where kids were going to school a couple of days a week. Out where I live, school was open, 5 days a week. There was a virtual option, kids were going all day. But in our area, pretty much everybody shut down completely between Thanksgiving and New Year's. Our practices business went up 71% last December compared to the year before that. And so, you look at this data, particularly with girls, and one of the things I would speculate looking at this is the social isolation that a lot of kids experienced during COVID hit them pretty hard. Now, this slide's a little deceptive in that part of what this is looking at is the increase in the number of medical claims relative to the overall number of medical claims submitted back in 2020 for various types of service. So that what you see looking at this is that in 13 to 18-year-olds, it looks like last March or last April, that basically the number of claims submitted for mental health service to insurance, basically doubled. That wasn't the case because there were significantly fewer medical claims because people are afraid to go to outpatient clinics and afraid to go to the hospital. But if you take a look across the board in people who had insurance, service utilization for kids relative to what it had been as a percentage of medical claims was high for all of last year. Now, in contrast to that, it wasn't that way for kids in lower income groups and kids in particular who are dependent upon Medicaid. So I don't know what your situation is where you guys are at in Illinois, but in Ohio, about half of the children in our state, are covered under Medicaid. And essentially, the number of billings or the number of claims for mental health services was cut in half. The explanation for this is that in our state, at least, in a lot of the areas where people are of more modest incomes, the vast majority of mental health service gets provided in the schools. And I do a lot of training and consultation for Stark County, which is a fairly large urban county here in Ohio. If you're familiar with the Pro Football Hall of Fame, Canton is the center of Stark County. And basically 75% of the schools in the county have relationships with various mental health agencies where counseling that kids receive is obtained on site. When you shut down the schools, one of the things I think people became aware of last year is that a lot of kids depend upon their school, for at least 2 meals a day for the bulk of the year, and that we got into issues with kids having, access to food, hunger issues. The other reality in a lot of places is that the vast preponderance of mental health service that kids get is through the school. And so when our schools are closed, kids lose access, to the services and the lifeline that a lot of them need. Now, this is looking specifically at data around substance abuse and overdoses. So that, like, when you look at teenage overdoses, again, that there was a big spike overall relative to general medical claims, where essentially relative to what they've been before, the number of insurance claims doubled. What's interesting with this is that if you take a look at like the numbers, the numbers there in green have to do with substance use disorders. That ended up going down pretty quickly after the pandemic began. And, the explanation for this is probably that when kids weren't allowed out of the house, it made it a lot harder for them, to be able to use substances, but they would continue to get their hands on things around the home that enabled them to overdose. Now, one of the things that we saw real clearly in our practice, like when we were going through last school year, is that, and this is a little crude way of putting it, is that there were certain kids who were essentially winners and losers because of the impact of COVID. And one of the groups who was most severely impacted early on were the kids that we had with obsessive compulsive disorder. So that, a lot of kids with OCD, part of how they manage their anxiety and they manage their obsessive thinking is by being busy. We see lots of kids where they do relatively well. For example, when they're going to school, they're in their routine, they have all of their extracurricular activities. But interestingly enough, in my practice, and this is before COVID, my 4 busiest weeks of the year are winter break and the first 2 weeks after school lets out for the summer. And the reason for that is that a lot of kids with anxiety and obsessive thinking use the busyness of their day as a distraction. It's their primary coping mechanism for dealing with their anxiety or their overthinking. When you shut down school and got rid of the extracurricular activities, that these kids that were important for so many of them last year, and they had way too much time to think. We saw big spikes in OCD. We saw big spikes in kids coming in, needing to be seen for anxiety. The ADHD issue is kind of an interesting one in that we oftentimes found that, for a lot of our kids, they had a lot more difficulty being able to focus, trying to watch school on a screen at home with all of the other environmental distractions. And so that we found that some kids needed relatively more aggressive treatment for that during remote learning. On the other hand, we had other kids where perhaps, particularly kids who maybe had like a comorbid issue with anxiety, or they didn't like taking medicine because it's making some other problem worse, they were able to get away with having to take a lot less. When schools went to virtual learning, or they only had to watch for 2 or 3 hours a day, as opposed to being attentive for 6 or 7 hours a day. So that, because like for a lot of these conditions, the impact that you see with kids, conditions such as like ADHD are highly dependent upon the environment that they're in. It's not surprising that we see some of these changes in terms of the prevalence of certain diagnoses. So this is anxiety, depression, and adjustment disorders. And again, I don't think that this is like a real big surprise to everybody, that when school closed last year and everything, or when school closed like 18 months ago and everything ground to a halt, there were big spikes that we saw. This, in terms of like my own practice, I'm not sure that it was as dramatic as this at first, because kids were relieved from a lot of their responsibilities and there wasn't the pressure in school the first year. Last year, we had like the mask, we had the social isolation, we had a lot of extracurricular activities thrown into chaos, and kids having a difficulty socializing and spending time with other kids. So we saw our big spike last fall and winter in terms of kids who were presenting, specifically for treatment for anxiety and depression. Now, what happens if you ask the kids how they feel about this stuff? And so this is from a survey that was funded by Morgan Stanley, where when they were asking teenagers, what has changed about their mental health since the beginning of the pandemic, 40% report struggles with anxiety, 39% depression. Social anxiety has emerged as a really big issue for a lot of kids. Again, kids who maybe had more of an obsessive compulsive personality developing like full-fledged types OCD symptoms. And so, this has been a very, very hard time on our kids. And again, this is a survey from the Child Mind Institute out of New York, talking to kids this past summer. What were their worries going forward? Again, falling behind in school, being anxious or worried in social situations, continuing to struggle with stress and loneliness. Like each of those things, you're talking about like 40 to 50% of the teen population, where this is a big concern right now. Now, since the beginning of school this year, when I start thinking about, well, who are the kids who've had the biggest struggles and who's been most vulnerable? One of our challenges has been kids. One group of kids that were like really happy when school closed were kids with social anxiety. But, when they've been in situations or when they were away from school for an extended period of time, because of COVID, I had one kid in particular where very, very challenging situations. So this is a boy who had issues with social anxiety, was in the 8th grade when COVID started. His parents are healthcare professionals, and they were very concerned about the possibility of, him being exposed to them and them, getting something from him going to school. So he did the virtual learning option the first half of the year, which was 9th grade and starting in a new high school. So, when the parents were ready to like send him back, for the second half of his freshman year, he's walking into a new high school, a large building that he's never set foot in before. And the social anxiety problems became overwhelming, where basically, we were doing, some fairly intensive behavioral interventions. And it took the bulk of last school year to be able to get him back to school. One of the issues that I see a lot, that I saw a lot last year and that continue in a lot of our school districts this year, is that for kids with ADHD, when schools switched to the block scheduling and the longer periods, this became a major, major issue for a lot of our kids. You have trouble being able to focus and concentrate, to begin with, and you go from having 45 or 50-minute classes to having some teachers who are lecturing for an hour and 20 or an hour and 30 minutes. Like, forget it for a lot of these guys. And so, so the having to stay focused for extended periods of time became a big struggle for a lot of those kids. Kids who struggle with social communication, who, with everybody being masked this year, have a harder time picking up on, facial expressions, sometimes being able to hear through like the mask, like subtleties in terms of like inflection of voice or tone of voice. I had a kid that I saw yesterday who talked about how much more difficult it was for him in his Spanish class in high school, trying to learn Spanish without being able to see the teacher's lips while she was talking in class. Now, before we spend too much time kind of like, wallowing and becoming preoccupied, with some of that kind of data and with the understanding that there are a lot of kids struggling, what are some of the things that we ought to be looking for that would make, that would suggest to you that, a child in your classroom, your son, your daughter, your niece, your nephew, a kid on the team that you coach, is experiencing significant mental health struggles? And so that this was a list that was developed by the Mayo Clinic under the leadership of a guy named Peter Jensen, who actually was honored to, the year I got the Exemplary Psychiatrist Award for the country by NAMI. He was the other child psychiatrist who got it. And so they put together this list of signs with very specific language to help parents to understand when kids were having an issue. And so number one on the list is that, if you see a child where they are very sad or withdrawn for 2 or more weeks, that's a red flag for depression. One of the things that we oftentimes see, like, you'll see kids where folks confuse like the terms like sad and depressed a lot. And we see kids who confuse those terms a lot. In that, it's not unusual for people to be sad or unhappy, some of the time. I was a season ticket holder for the Browns for 25 years. I am very familiar with sadness and unhappiness. Yeah, I heard somebody laugh. That, yeah. From whence I speak. Odell Beckham finally broke today, but couldn't take it anymore. But When you start getting concerned about depression, it's when you have kids who are sad or unhappy most of the time, most every day, for a minimum of 2 weeks. And that's oftentimes accompanied by the loss of the ability to be able to experience pleasure or losing interest in the things that they would normally enjoy. Now, number two, I think, is pretty obvious that, about half of our school age kids, about half of adolescents, 50% of adolescent population will have some fleeting thought at some point in time about suicide. Most of those thoughts, again, it's normative. You'll hear kids say things like, that, maybe I wish I'd never been born, or wouldn't I be better off if I wasn't here? But it doesn't mean that they're necessarily at risk of doing something about it. So that when you start hearing about kids who have a plan, or kids who have tried in the past who are thinking about, suicide or serious self-harm, that's a big red flag. Excuse me. The third are kids who have sudden, overwhelming fear for no apparent reason, oftentimes accompanied by, rapid heartbeat, difficulty breathing, an overwhelming sense of dread. That's a sign that kids may be experiencing panic attacks. And kids who have a propensity toward agoraphobia are more likely to get them in confined places where it's hard to leave without drawing attention to themselves. And one of the most common places that would fit that definition for school age kids is school. And so, oftentimes, we're seeing kids after they've been to the pediatrician, they've had an EKG test done, everything's okay. And one of the reasons why I oftentimes end up in meetings and working together with folks at school is to look at developing some accommodations to help it, to make it easier for these kids, to be able to stay in class as opposed to ending up in the nurse's office all the time. So number four, I think, obviously, if you have a kid who's in multiple fights, using a weapon, wanting to hurt other people, that's a big problem. Severe out of control behavior, like aggression. And one of the things that I would encourage you to think about is that oftentimes kids who are having protracted meltdowns, these kids where they get stuck on something and for 30 minutes or an hour or 2 hours, they're experiencing symptoms of rage, these very protracted meltdowns. Oftentimes anxiety or obsessive thinking is the driver for those kinds of meltdowns. Kids, again, who aren't eating, making themselves throw up, are using laxatives to try to lose weight, signs of an eating disorder. We started seeing a little bit more of this creep back into the picture during COVID, because, for a lot of kids, it becomes a way of managing their sense that life is out of control. Again, when you start having kids who have specific worries or fears that get in the way of their ability to be able to do day-to-day kinds of activities, kids, again, with extreme difficulty concentrating or staying still, and kids where maybe they have an issue with focus or motivation, where they are significantly underachieving compared to what you would predict for their intelligence. Those are signs of a kid who might be at risk of ADHD, ADD or ADHD. The interesting thing in our practice is that the mean, median, and modal age of our new kids with ADHD is 13. And I have 4 teenagers with ADHD for every school age kid in our practice. And one of the reasons for this is that, if you think about it, basically there's 2 things that get you into my office if you're a kid who's struggling with ADHD. They're the kids who are first, second, third grade. They come into school, they're extremely impulsive, they're aggressive, they're disruptive, they're getting fights on the playground, they get sent to the principal's office. Those kids get picked up pretty early. But if your behavior isn't so out of control that it becomes a problem in school, a lot of kids, if they're reasonably intelligent, can be in la land like 80 to 90% of the time, and get through about fifth or sixth grade on intelligence alone. What we typically see is like when kids go from having like, getting homework from one or two teachers a day to like sixth, seventh, eighth grade when they're getting it from like 4 or 5 different teachers a day. Or you start getting homework assignments where you have to have the self-discipline to work on it a half an hour a night for a week or for 2 weeks. For a lot of these kids, that it's in middle school and high school that the wheels start coming off because they have the intelligence to do the work, but they don't have the organizational skills or the motivation to manage the workload. And oftentimes like really bright kids with ADHD go unidentified, because that they have a longer distance to slide before their grades get to the point, that they're getting red flagged or people are concerned about them failing. Obviously, kids who are repeatedly using alcohol or drugs, kids who have mood swings that are so pronounced that it makes it difficult for them to maintain relationships, or kids who have fairly drastic or dramatic changes in what had been their established personality. All of those things are the kinds of red flags that would make me think that, if there's a kid I love in my life who's doing these kinds of things, those are red flags that are suggesting that there's something going on that probably needs to be addressed. Now, my guess is that identifying the problems is probably a lot easier where you folks live than finding someone who's able to give you the help that you need when your child has one of these problems. About 3 months ago, I was having breakfast with the guy who's the president of our local child and adolescent psychiatry society here in Northeast Ohio. And interestingly enough, he spends the vast majority of his work time doing telemedicine with kids through mental health centers in rural Illinois who are desperately in need of his services. And so, if you take a look at a map, while, the state of Illinois overall, has a fairly significant number of child and adolescent mental health professionals, the fact that they're all in and around Chicago doesn't necessarily help the case, when your kid's struggling. So I'm a parent and I'm sitting here listening to this tonight and I'm worried about my kid. Where do I go to get help and how do I find the right help, where I live? And I would say that probably the best advice would be to start with your pediatrician, or your primary care doc if if your child's seen by a family doctor. Typical pediatrician has about 2,000 kids under their care nowadays. That they are probably seeing a fairly large cross section of kids who are dealing with all of these kinds of issues. They would also be pretty familiar because of the families going through their practice with what's available in your area in terms of like mental health services, and who has specific expertise working with certain kinds of kids for common problems. Like, which therapists or counselors actually do cognitive behavioral therapy when you have a kid who's struggling with anxiety, for example. Increasingly, one of the trends that we're seeing around the country, and I don't know if this has started to happen yet in your area of rural Illinois, is the notion of integrated care. And so one of the projects that I had been working on with the community mental health system in the county I work with here in Ohio was implanting mental health professionals, in fact, child psychiatrists, in different pediatric practices in the community, with the idea of making care more accessible and helping the pediatricians learn to be able to take care of a variety of different conditions. So if you don't have a pediatrician or if they're not aware of resources, I'm not sure like what the closest pediatric hospital would be to you guys. I guess like, Riley in Indianapolis would be quite a distance. Maybe you've got like some smaller things, again, in like Eastern Illinois, but oftentimes, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Steve, we have St. Francis over in Peoria.
Okay. Yeah. So that oftentimes, like if you've got like if you got a pediatric hospital, particularly one where they have like pediatric residents, that they're probably going to have a fairly decent range of services. And that's probably a place where you're going to find maybe more specialized, psychiatrists, psychologists for kids with more complicated mental, emotional, or developmental disabilities. Now, the third piece, and again, I'm curious about this, that does your school system have some sort of a partnership with like local community mental health in terms of making services available through school? If that's not available, one of the things that I know in our area is that most of the schools where I'm at, keep specific referral lists for parents of, of folks that they know in the community who specialize in working with children and teenagers. Another source you don't think about a whole lot would be your health insurance company, especially if you start getting the runaround and find like the first 2 or 3 people that you call, who allegedly take your family's insurance, but turn out that they don't. That insurance companies are accredited by organizations that look at and grade them on the basis of the ease with which and the speed with which their customers are able to get access to medical care. And so, like, if you're in a pinch, one of the things that you might be able to do, would be to call your insurance company, and they can help. They sometimes have the leverage to help facilitate getting you in with somebody fairly quickly. Now, I did a little bit of work on Google last night. I understand that, like, as it is here in Ohio, there are also community mental health boards in Illinois that are responsible for providing services to people in the communities where they're based. And so your mental health board would oftentimes be able to refer you to specific facilities, agencies, where they're getting public funds to be able to provide care. Interestingly enough, there are more folks when they have a mental health need who will reach out to a member of the clergy than there are folks who will reach out specifically to a psychiatrist. So that, if you happen to be connected to a church or some other place of worship, I wouldn't overlook them as a potential resource. And then the other piece, again, like if you know other parents and your network fairly well at the school and people who have had struggles, probably the majority of the referrals that my practice gets at this point have come from friends of families who have already been seen by us. And so that if you know other people who have had similar experiences with their children, they're oftentimes like a great source of feedback in terms of, whether their experience was positive or negative, and whether their child got what they needed out of that particular facility or out of that particular service provider. So at this point, I will go ahead and wind down and turn the floor back over to Michelle and open it up for questions. But if you're interested in like learning more about me, what I do, the other thing that I'm involved with on the side is that I'm the board president of an organization where we work with churches around the country and around the world to welcome families who have kids with a very broad range of disabilities. So if you're interested in that, interested in any of the other stuff that I'm involved with, feel free to email me. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook every Sunday night making comments about whatever bizarre new way the Browns found to lose that week. And so don't be a stranger. So if I can be a resource to you or to your school, feel free to reach out.
Okay, so let's see. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody? Nobody typed any into the chat. And I'm curious if anybody here in the auditorium has questions. Did anybody write anything down? I have one if nobody else had one. Mr. Jones, are you scratching your head or you really want my attention? Okay, we have that recorded for all to know now. Earlier you talked about adjustment disorder. That was a new term for me. Can you just tell us like in 3 sentences what that is?
Kids who have short-lived emotional or behavioral symptoms in response to a specific stressor. So that, like, for example, like you have a whole list of different diagnoses, so that there can be, you can have an adjustment disorder with anxious mood. You can have an adjustment disorder with depressed mood, an adjustment disorder with mixed features of emotion and conduct. So like, that this would be the kid who, ends up like being referred to the counselor's office where, their dog has died and they're refusing to come to school and they're angry and they're having meltdowns at home. And none of this stuff was like going on before, before their dog crossed the rainbow bridge.
Okay, thank you. One of the questions we had in chat, I'll get to you in a second. Can we have information about our partnership with Chestnut Mental Health? And Shelby mentioned that, and absolutely, I can get that information to you. Chestnut Mental Health is located in Bloomington Normal, and Dr. O'Donnell has already made a comment in the chat that we use them on a regular basis. They do provide counseling services to our district, so that's a great piece of information for you to have. Okay, can I bring you the microphone? Okay.
What would be a couple of pieces of advice or things that parents can do once we've identified that our child has one or more conditions? My son has ADHD, anxiety, and depression, and it's a real challenge. So I'd love some words of wisdom or advice.
So words of wisdom to a parent who has a child with the diagnosis of ADHD, anxiety, and depression.
Okay. One of the things that is oftentimes a really large challenge, and what you just described was that's probably the most common profile of new kids that I have coming through our practice. And one of the things that I see a lot is that probably the typical kid who comes to see me has been to several other people. And an observation that I've made, like after seeing lots and lots of these kids and being involved in several research studies, is that it's very important, if you're getting them help, to have someone who is, thoughtful, particularly in terms of like their use of medication, and someone who has an understanding of the reality that oftentimes, like, the kinds of medicine that we will use for kids can make other problems worse and can greatly complicate a situation. So that, what I see oftentimes would be kids who, for example, like maybe have an issue with ADHD, and anxiety, and sometimes the anxiety gets really bad and they have episodes of depression. One of the things that we see a lot, if you think about so this group of kids, and it's a fairly large group. So about 30% of kids with ADHD, statistically speaking, would meet criteria for at least one anxiety disorder. About 50% of adults with ADHD meet criteria for at least one anxiety disorder. And again, that runs about 85% in our practice, because one of the things that you see a lot with kids is having, in these kids with where they're maybe like anxious and have ADHD, is having the one problem helps compensate for the second problem. Treating the second problem oftentimes makes the first problem worse. So that, like, for example, if you think about it, like if you're a kid who's anxious, you're obsessive, you're prone to getting depressed. And one of the things that happens is that you get stuck on, or you get fixated on, you spend a lot of time thinking about things that bother you. Having ADHD is actually really adaptive, because if you're getting distracted by other things that are going on around you, it becomes a lot harder to like wallow in your own junk. So what we see sometimes, like when kids get started on medicine for ADHD, part of what that medicine does is it will tend to make them intensely more aware of what's on their mind in the moment. And if that's like, if that's like banging out their math homework, that's a really good thing. If it's, dwelling on how they were bullied on the playground that day, that's not such a good thing. And so, one of the things that we see sometimes with these kids is that oftentimes, like, the kind of medicine that you would need to give them to help with like attention and concentration and focus in school sometimes can make them more moody, emotional, and irritable. And a lot of times the kids who are prone to that would be, again, like kids with, these quote unquote like comorbid diagnoses. Now the other thing that we see is that, and this was something, we were involved in a big federal study looking at safety and side effect issues with these antidepressant, anti-anxiety medicines. And one of the things a lot of folks don't realize is it's a lot of times those medicines will make kids' ADHD worse. In that we see a lot of kids who maybe use their like ADHD or anxiety as their compensatory, or their anxiety or their worry is their compensatory mechanism for their ADHD. So I have kids where they have no intrinsic desire to do their homework, but eventually they worry enough about their homework that they do it, so they stop worrying about it. Now, a lot of times you'll give kids this medicine, if you take away their worries, if they don't worry, they don't care. If they don't care, nothing gets done. And so one of the challenges you see kids have sometimes with that is that when they're on medicine for depression, they may struggle with motivation. The other piece is that there are certain kids who become more impulsive when they're taking that kind of medicine. And that's what we in fact think that the mechanism is for this subgroup of kids, where they issue these warnings about there being an increase in suicidal thinking or behavior. That literally, like, for that subgroup of kids, one of the things that medicine's doing is interfering with the pathways that are in the brain that are involved with impulse control and self-regulating emotion. So when you talk about when you ask the question, like tips for a parent, like in that situation, one of the things that I think would be a tip is that if you're in a situation where you're looking at medicine, which would be true for most kids with ADHD and some kids, for anxiety and depression, that understanding that when things aren't going well, the immediate reaction isn't to add more medicine to the situation, but to try to simplify things, to to make sure that some folks who are doing this aren't inadvertently making things harder on your child with the medicine that they're giving them, is probably like the most common thing that I would get asked about in our practice for kids with that constellation of stuff.
All righty. Okay. Now they're on the roll.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. You talked early on about the dangers of social media. What recommendations would you have for parents of younger kids who aren't yet on social media, like to start allowing them access to social media, monitoring it, just banning it altogether? What would be your recommendation?
Okay.
I recommend ban it completely, but that's not realistic, is it?
Well, our girls got their first phones Christmas time of their 6th grade year. If I were in this situation again, I'm not sure that I would let them have one until high school. The self-image stuff, especially with girls, appears to be such an issue that that I would want to be very, very careful about overseeing that. I think it's important, and one of the rules that we had for our kids, is that, mom and dad are paying Verizon and we got you your phone. We have the right to take a look at that phone, at any time that we have, any time that we feel that we need to go ahead and do that. And the other thing that we told our kids is that you can go ahead and join whatever social media platforms you like, except, in order to be on there, you have to agree to friend us so that we can have an eye on what you're doing on those platforms. So if your kids are going to be on there, I think that, that you need to be able to have access to see what they're posting and what other people are posting about them. And I think that you need to be aware of, other things that may be going on or other reasons why they are using their phones. Even, including and outside of like some of the social media platforms. I had a kid, this is a boy, he was in middle school last year, where apparently, from what I understand, after one of the football games one night, he was on Snapchat exposing himself. And the FBI get really interested in child pornography, and a couple of police officers came to the house because they were able, with like the facial recognition software, to figure out who this kid was. And so I think that, being aware of not only like what social media platforms they're on and what people are posting about them on those platforms, but being aware of their browser history is something else that's really important, because the other thing that I'm seeing is that I'm seeing a lot of kids who are struggling, and this includes girls, with issues that they have after seeing or being excessively preoccupied with pornography that they're able to access over the internet. I mean, you think about it, like when you give your kid a smartphone, they're carrying like the largest pornographic library, or access to that, the largest pornographic library in the history of man, in their pocket or in their purse. And so, again, I think that given the nature of the world that our kids are in, parents need to be really watchful, and they have to be aware of like what their kids are doing on these platforms.
I think we have one more question.
My son is diagnosed with anxiety and depression. My issues is, I guess, how do you know how far to push them when they are, I don't know, being reclusive, not being able to focus on the schoolwork? How do you know where that fine line is between, is this real, or are they using their diagnosis to not do their work?
Okay. Okay, first off, one of the things that I tell our kids, like when I see kids in the practice, is that having a diagnosis is not an excuse. That may make it more difficult for you to do certain things, or you may have to put more effort into certain things than your brother or sister may, or other kids in your class may. But there's no reason why you can't typically do, unless you're looking at like a kid with like a specific like learning issue, or processing issue or something like that, where there are legitimate reasons why it's much harder for them to do their work. So part of what I'm doing is I'm setting the expectation up front that you need to be able to do this. Now, the kinds of things, like, again, like a kid with like depression or a kid with anxiety, that I'm going to be like looking at to see, well, are they legitimately in a position where this is something that they're having a hard time doing? Is that I'm going to start looking for maybe like, specific like physical markers or physical symptoms, that indicate that they're having like a more severe problem. For example, like, a lot of times, kids, when they're struggling with depression or anxiety, have a lot of trouble falling asleep. They have a lot of trouble staying asleep. When kids don't get enough sleep, that clearly impacts, memory, recall, executive functioning, sort of the ability to organize and prioritize your work. So if I'm seeing, if I'm seeing that kids, are having those kinds of issues, they're complaining about a lot of, physical signs and symptoms associated maybe with stress or anxiety. My head hurts, my stomach hurts. I don't feel good. They're in the nurse's office 3 days a week at school, that they're missing an inordinate amount of school, or they're needing to, or asking you, to take a lot of mental health days. That would be something that would, that would be a sign. Is it, is the nature of their anxiety or depression impacting other areas of functioning beyond like what you're asking them to do at school? I mean, so like, I understand that like nobody wants to write their paper for like English class, but if your kid's in a situation where, they're on the basketball team and they don't want to go to basketball practice either, or they're not real interested in going over and like visiting their friend on Friday night, or, heaven forbid, they start losing interest in and they're spending a lot less time online gaming with their friends. That would be something that I would look at. So if you see them like isolating from friends in addition to isolating from you, if you see it impacting like their ability, in terms of like participating in, in extracurricular kinds of activities, if you're seeing that there's a relationship between their mood and specific struggles with school performance, in my mind, those would all be kind of red flags that they really have something that they're struggling with, and that maybe looking at either getting them help or making adjustments in the nature of the help that they're getting would be appropriate in those kinds of situations.
All right, Steve, I'm going to take the last question out of the chat box. And this question is, what are suggestions for talking through mental health issues with students and children with limited social / communication / vocabulary skills?
Okay. The kinds of kids that like I would think about, like, in that vein, might be kids like, kids on the autism spectrum, for example. One of the things that we would oftentimes like recommend would be like, maybe various kinds of social stories, to help them to understand a little bit more, in turn, especially like if they're in a situation where maybe, that they're going to be entering into a new experience, they're going to be going to see a counselor, they're going to be going to see a doctor. That there's an awful lot of stuff that you can communicate through like pictures and images, for kids who struggle with like language processing and struggle with words. We also know that, there are folks who have formal training in like art therapy and play therapy, for kids who have various issues, in terms of like developmental disabilities or kids with language expression, so that there are other modalities for being able to work with them and to provide them with care and support, aside from like expecting them to sit down in a room and talk to a counselor for 30 minutes or 50 minutes.
Great. All right, Steve, we are going to wrap up our time for you.